Now, the next voice you'll hear after my introduction is that of Lieutenant Governor Cyrus Habib, our very own Chief Opportunity Officer. Oh, we're gonna clap. Let's clap. And as we know, we're in session, and because I was cued from the stage, I'm going to just forfeit reading his bio. You can read that in your agenda. And instead, I'm going to ask that you please join me in welcoming Lieutenant Governor Cyrus Habib to the stage.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that warm introduction, and thank you for not artificially raising expectations by reading a long bio. I want to tell you, first of all, let me start by thanking the sponsors. It was done just a moment ago, but it is really important. I know we've got some state agencies, we've got labor. I think it's important to recognize that's support that's coming from rank and file members, state employees who are contributing to make this conference happen, and as well as friends from the private sector. We really do appreciate all of you helping from among your budgets. Everyone's got many priorities, and it's really, really very meaningful to us, to Governor Inslee, to me, to our state leaders, that sponsors stepped up to make this day a success. I want to thank the organizers, of course, the council itself, the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Council, and all the subcommittees that came together, Dr. Johnson just mentioned, that have come together to work to make this first annual. And you know, sometimes people say, don't say first annual because it's not annual yet. Come on. I mean, what kind of thinking is that? You know what I mean? This is like, what? Of course it's first annual. And that being said, that means this is both the best so far, but also it will be the worst in history, because every year you guys are going to improve on this and make it even bigger and better. So congratulations, thank you to all the people that worked hard to do this work. This is actually, it's very near and dear to my heart, because the first thing I did in public service of any kind was serving as an appointed King County Civil Rights Commissioner when I came out of law school. And I came back here and was actually, believe it or not, nominated by a Republican. And I think all right, I'm not going to say okay, so I was nominated by a Republican. See, you get to a certain age and you start to learn how to assert self-control. But he nominated me, and I don't think he realized that it would be a catalyst for me to get into public office. That's the more polite way of what I was going to say. And it was. It was absolutely the experience of spending those few years on the Civil Rights Commission, working on issues of equity and social justice, were a huge part of how I came to learn how the corridors of power are operated, and to really have the self-confidence to be able to run for office myself and be able to do the work that I'm doing. So you all, in addition to the council members and all of you who are attending today, you not only are you doing important work in your own right, but you're inspiring others who you may not even know may end up joining us in this struggle and in this important work. So I want to tell you, you know, what I don't want to do, because I was thinking about this, and you'll notice that I don't read from notes. I don't do prepared speeches or talking points. It keeps my staff young and nervous because but it's like people say, don't let someone go off script, but I don't bring a script. So what I thought about saying was, okay, so I've got remarks to kind of persuade people or make the case for why we need a diverse and equitable and inclusive workforce. But then as I'm we're driving down here, I'm thinking to myself, well, why would I say that to these people? Because they're already here, right? You're already doing it. So I'm not gonna, kind of pander or condescend or try to say things that you guys already know and know far better than I do, because most of you are doing it every single day. So I'm not going to try to preach to the choir here. What I am going to do is tell you a bit about my own story, a couple episodes from my journey that inform how I view these set of issues. And then I think we're going to have a little bit of time to do some Q&A. And so we can get into, I guess, more controversial things then. But I want to just tell you some stories from my personal life. So my parents were immigrants to this country. They came here from Iran. And I would add that they likely would not have been able to come under the law as it is today, under the executive order as President Trump issued it. My father came here to study at the University of Washington on a student visa that he wouldn't be able to get right now. And my mother came later on in the decade when they were engaged and joined him and came to study at the University of Maryland. I was born in Baltimore, and hey, that's not every day that you hear. So then that person knows that it's Baltimore, not Baltimore. That's the proper pronunciation. That's where I was born. And, and I'll say this, I mean, you all know, some of you are immigrants or children of immigrants, and we're all, with the exception of those whose land we're standing on, as was said earlier, and thank you to the Muckleshoot tribe, we're all immigrants or descended from immigrants. My parents came here in search of economic opportunity, educational access, as I mentioned, and political and religious freedoms. And it was a tough time for them to come here my father came here in the early 70s, but when my mom came here and they were starting a family, it was right during the hostage crisis. And in a time when even more than now, and even more than directly after 9/11, specifically being Iranian American was a very toxic identity. And as if that wasn't hard enough for them, shortly after I was born, I was diagnosed with a rare childhood eye cancer that took the eyesight in my left eye when I was a newborn, and then came back again and took the eyesight in my right eye when I was 8 years old. And so I often joke that was in 1989 that I became blind. That's when I was 8 years old. So all 8 years that I could see did take place entirely within the 1980s. So all my visual memories to this very day, still 30 years later, from the 1980s. So everyone still looks like Cyndi Lauper and Boy George. I appreciate you clapping for that, because when I told that, I often tell that, and I'll let you in on this kind of public speaking hack of mine, which is that I do that both because it's true, and I think it's an evocative way to give people a sense of how to, set foot in someone else's experience, but also because, it kind of kills the tension a little bit, right? People are, of course, no one wants to hear that the person talking to them had cancer when they were a kid and became blind. It's not a good thing. It's not a positive thing. So when I told that at the commencement at Central Washington University last year, they all knew that the part about the 80s was funny, so they all laughed at that part. Then when I mentioned Cyndi Lauper and Boy George, there was like silence, and then I heard where the parents were sitting, right? Like, so I appreciate your support. But, as you can imagine, having those kinds of challenges, childhood cancer, child of immigrants, kind of funny name, to quote former president, and a disability, posed some obstacles, created some challenges. And there's a story that I like to tell when I want to describe the path that I traveled from Braille to Yale and beyond. And the story, some of you may have heard me say it, but if you've heard me speak, I tell it pretty often. It's from when I was in 3rd grade. We'd moved from Maryland to Washington State. We moved to Bellevue. And we moved to Bellevue in large part because my parents did their homework and figured out that's where there's a school district that's well-funded, relatively well-funded, and thankfully they were in a fortunate position. They could be able to afford a home in Bellevue at that time. And so I was in 3rd grade, and what's every 3rd grader's favorite time of the school day? Recess, right? So just want to make sure you're paying attention. So my school was no different, and so we'd be waiting all morning for recess to come around. But the school district didn't love the idea of this kid who had recently become blind playing 5 feet off the ground on the slippery jungle gym, monkey bars, swing set. Maybe because they knew I'd recently become blind, and maybe because they knew my mother was a litigator. So they kept me by the school building on the sidelines with the recess monitors while the other kids were playing. And there's nothing against recess monitors, but that wasn't what I had in mind. So I went home after this had happened a few times. I went home and told my parents, that I'm being excluded. And they were as indignant, thankfully, as I was. And my mom went to the school the next day, and this is important. She took me with her to the principal's office so that I could learn how to become an advocate for myself. And she said to the principal of the school, I'm going to take my son to your school over the weekend, and I'm going to take him to the jungle gym and show him how to get around the whole playground. And she said, he's going to learn it differently, but he's going to learn his way around just as well as any other kid. And she said, it may happen that he may slip and fall, and he may even slip and fall and break his arm. That's a fear that any mother has. But she said, I can fix a broken arm, I can never fix a broken spirit. Now, I tell that story all the time because that really, it was a more transformative moment for me than becoming blind, right? Because that's the moment that I learned no matter what would happen to me, I deserved to be included. And thank God I did, because there were a number of times as I went through school when we had to fight for my inclusion. And sometimes my parents were there, and I was fortunate to have them, and that they had the education and the capacity to stick up for me, but then sometimes they weren't there, and I had to learn how to advocate for myself. But as I grew older, I realized that there are so many, most people don't have the benefit of a 24-hour-a-day pro bono attorney, right, to teach them. And so I ended up going to law school and going into public life because I wanted to be that advocate for other people. And which takes me to the second episode I wanted to tell you about. So this is almost 15 years ago. I was in law school. I was a first-year law student, and Wi-Fi was new to law schools or to universities at that time. But thanks to the Department of Services for the Blind and the State School for the Blind and others, I'd learned how to use adaptive software on the computer that reads what's on the screen, right? And some of you may be familiar with it. So I was using that, and I had like one little earphone bud in one ear, so I could take notes on what the professor was saying, and then with the other ear, I was ostensibly listening to what the professor was saying. And so I'll never forget, I was sitting there in civil procedure class, not, for all the lawyers in the room, you can back me up, not the most fascinating subject matter. And so I was on the New York Times website, just checking the news, and I read about a case. And that case was called American Council of the Blind versus Paulson. Hank Paulson was at the time the Treasury Secretary, and the case was about, basically the case is saying that it is illegal it is against federal law, the Rehabilitations Act, that U.S. currency is not accessible to the blind, the actual bills. And I totally agreed because I had just lived in England for 3 years. And I loved the fact that I didn't need to, fold my bills in different shapes and size, all the different things that people who are blind had to do. Put them in different pockets or whatever, all these different tricks that you have to learn. And so I was like, I love the fact that this case happened. I went and told my professor, he was also the dean of the law school, and I said, not that I wasn't paying attention during class, but I've recently learned about this lawsuit, and I want to figure out how to get involved. And he said, well, you ought to find someone who has an interest in this litigation, and you should become their attorney as a friend of the court. And so I ended up going to the Perkins School for the Blind, which was the school that Helen Keller attended. It's the oldest school for the blind in our country. And talking to them about an issue that I didn't feel had been raised in the litigation. See, the way that they were talking about in the case was that if you're a customer, let's say you're going to a coffee shop, okay? Let's say, look, Starbucks has been in the news the last few days. Let's say you're going to Starbucks, okay? And you're getting a cup of coffee and you give a $20 bill and they give you 4 bills back and you're the customer. You don't know, but you hope that those are 3 5s and a 1, for example, right? Not just 4 singles. That's what the case was talking about. But I said, what about the person on the other side of the cash register? What about the other side of the counter? Because I know that, I remember, like, I didn't work in the student store at my school. And it starts even earlier with what I call the lemonade stand effect. Where, lemonade stand because I grew up in Baltimore. I don't actually know, I don't have kids, so I don't know whether 4-year-olds here do lemonade stands. We did in Baltimore, it was hot. So no 4-year-old, any 4-year-old knows not to put the blind kid on cashier duty, right? So we made this case. It was about labor. It was about equitable employment, really, right? Because most entry-level jobs require the ability to denominate one bill from another. So you close those off to people with blind, you're closing off entry-level employment, which leads to other employment and other experiences and skills. And so, but we made that case, and we ended up actually winning the support on the DC Circuit, second highest court in the country, of we had 2 conservatives and 1 liberal on the bench. We won one of the conservatives over to win that case because he said, I don't really buy this argument. He didn't like the argument about the customers, but he really bought the argument about people not wanting to be on social welfare programs, wanting to work. So addendum to that story is that then we had to, of course, go and figure out how do we make these bills accessible to the blind. And I went to Congress to testify on that, and there were all different proposals. By the way, that's where I learned that if you can't think of someone to oppose an idea, you're not thinking hard enough, because that's when I met the vending machine lobby. So we're talking about how to make these bills accessible, and my favorite one is still Congressman Pete Stark's idea of cutting different sized corners, different numbers of corners off the bills, so you could tell if you're blind which one it is, 5 or 10 or 20. And I just love it because I love the idea of Congress finally admitting that they want to cut corners. It's a little jab at the federal government. But as a result of all that work, not mainly others, not mine, but as a result of all this advocacy that happened, when the new $20 bill comes out, which will have a woman on it for the first time, it will also be the first bill that will be tactilely distinguishable. Third episode and final episode I want to share with you has to do with what I'm doing right now. So most people are too polite to ask the question that's on their mind when they meet me, which is, what does the Lieutenant Governor actually do? Hopefully it's in my bio so you can find out, but briefly, I fill in for the governor when he's out of state, and partner with him on a number of initiatives, such as some of these that we work with you all on. I run my own office with our own priorities, largely around higher education and economic development. And then I most visibly, to many of you, I preside over the state Senate. I'm the president of the Senate, irrespective of which party is in the majority. So I tell you that because it turns out that I ran for there are 9 statewide political offices, okay, in our state, very populist constitution. And I happened to run for the only one that seemingly requires eyesight, because you have to be able to call on senators when they want to speak. And so this was actually used against me in the campaign, including by my Democratic opponents. It said, how could he do that? They wouldn't say it publicly, but behind closed doors, they say, how is he even going to be able to preside? But I remembered the playground story, right? I remembered, and I said, let's win the election, and then I'll figure out how to do it, and I may do it differently, but I'll do it just as well. And then I didn't need the part about the broken arm, but, I remembered the lesson. So I got elected, and then I'm like, oh man, we got to actually figure out how to do this. So my original thought was, maybe what we'll do is have a staff person just tell me who wants to speak. And that's kind of what I thought throughout the campaign. And, and I'll tell you, I'm not totally irresponsible and just power hungry. I mean, in my mind, as I said to people at the time that would ask me, I said, if the presiding over the Senate just means being able to see people, then we could just have a camera do that, right? I mean, they would the position is more than that, right? And so I said, okay, we got to fix it. That's why I didn't give it a whole lot of thought. But then we said, okay, maybe we'll have a staff person sit there and do that. And then we thanks to the brilliant people that work for the state Senate and the legislative branch generally, and folks at DSB and others, we figured out a better way. And I hope you come and visit the Senate. We'd love to show it to you. What that is there's touch screens on every senator's desk, and when they want to speak, they press a button, flat button on their touch screen, and it sends a signal up to a computer where I'm standing at the front of the Senate, and it shows their name in real time in Braille, on a Braille display. All the names of the people that want to speak, okay? Who are you clapping for? Braille? No, you're clapping for innovation and for the people who came up with the solution. But here's why I tell you that episode, because here's what's important about it. When you're the lieutenant governor or you're the president of the state Senate, you walk in there, of course they're going to figure out how to make it work. Even if they had to have a full-time person there to do nothing other than to see people standing. Think about how insane that, but they would do it. Why? Because look at my job title. Look at how important sounding it is, right? Look at, right? I'm friends with the governor, you know what I mean? Of course they would do it. Here's why it's important. What about every other job in the state, right? That's the point. So it's not, this is the thing, it's not that we can't do it, right? It's not that we can't do these things. And I know I've been talking a lot about disability, and in the Q&A we'll talk about equity more broadly, but I just wanted to say this because this is the thing where I think in a lot of ways disability is going to be the most challenging long term, because unlike other distinctions and differences that are largely or entirely, the implications of which, the inequalities from which come from a constructed understanding, there are actual challenges for people with disabilities to do things the same way. Okay, so that's a reality. But the point is, if you have the imagination and the willpower, we know we have the money to do it. We know when it matters we can do it, right? Well, I'm here to say it matters all the time, not just when the person has a political office. So I wanted to tell you those 3 episodes, and I know we're gonna do a Q&A now, but the point here of these 3 is to tell you from my experience, what do these 3 episodes demonstrate to me? Number 1, that advocacy is important, and that starting early on, I'm so happy that OSPI is represented here, and I think maybe hopefully some folks from early learning. It starts early on to give kids that sense of belief and confidence in themselves, that no matter what their identity is, they deserve to be included. Secondly, I told you a story about the currency. because it's important to understand that we tend to think about big picture items when we think of structural barriers. Well, that's one that I bet most of you didn't even think about, and you guys think about this stuff a lot, right? About dollar bills and can someone, how does people stay out of the workforce because they can't tell a 5 from a 10? The point is there are these pockets of injustice all over. And so the best way to discover them is to talk to people in their lived experiences. Like I had lived that experience, which is why I knew, like not being able to work at the student store. And then the third one I told you, again, it's this idea that thank God, we've got so much technology. Thank God we have the ability to do outreach to all kinds of communities to recruit folks. Question is, do we really want to do it? Do we really think it's important? Do we believe that every single kid in every classroom ought to be treated like they're the lieutenant governor or governor of the state? Every single worker wants a job. Every single person in our political system who wants to vote, are we going to treat every single person like they're that important? So those are the takeaways and lessons from those episodes I wanted to share with you. And now let's transition. Do we have time? We have time for Q&A, right? I spoke a lot, but I think we have time for some questions and answers. Okay.
So I see a hand in the back. Do we have a question?
Yes, I have a question.
Okay.
Thank you again, Lieutenant Governor, for being here.
Yep.
Not only for your inspirational story, but for how you are showing us that this administration, you and the governor at the lead, are taking equity, diversity, and inclusion as an essentiality, not an add-on or a checkoff box. And my question has to do with, as the governor is transitioning out or on or going to these future adventures, whatever it may be, what is the state of Washington doing right now to ensure that there will be a continuation of this kind of leadership, this kind of encouragement, and this kind of support for all of the initiatives and the energy that so many of us here today are putting into fairness, embracing difference, and increasing participative voice through inclusion?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question, and so I don't know the governor's plans. So nice trying to get an answer out of me on that. Don't know, but here's what I'll say. I mean, whether the governor runs and serves for a third term, whether someone else is the next governor, the answer is, look, this council was formed under a previous governor, right? So it has continued, and I think the best answer, I'll give you the best kind of on paper answer, and I think it's also true too, but the real answer ultimately is that voters, and one by one, but mainly through coalitions, need to hold candidates accountable and ask that exact question, right? So I'm not a candidate for governor, so I can give you my answer, but if there's an election, there will be an election, but if there are new candidates running, if the governor doesn't run again and others run to replace him, or if people run to challenge him in 2020, those are the folks that you should be saying, here's the progress we've made so far. Are you going to support that, encourage it? Are you going to do even better going forward? And then make sure that they give good, smart answers, and that voters know and understand the differences between candidates on those answers. That's how, when you look at how organized labor does it, when you look at how business associations do it, or environmental groups, or women's rights groups and LGBT rights groups, all those groups, the way that they do is they got questionnaires, they do interviews, they do public forums and debates. So one of the things I felt for a long time is that folks with disabilities need to do the same thing, but for all the other constituencies represented here, many of you are already doing that when it comes to inclusion and equity and diversity. But that's the forum to do it. But I also think that's another reason why the folks who work in state government are so essential, because the political leadership changes, but most of the time, the folks doing the work don't change, and that continuity is hugely important. And then there's the legislative branch too. And so I would encourage everyone to, I know we're focusing on the executive here, but the money for all this, where does it come from? The policies, executive orders are great, laws are better, right? So that's also mightily important to establish and build those legislative relationships. And I have one foot in the legislative branch as president of the Senate, as well as one in the executive branch. So if folks are interested in figuring out how to do that work and advocacy during the session, our office is happy to help you to do that as well. Other questions?
As people are thinking,
You have questions for me. I know you
Lieutenant
do.
Governor, would you give the people time to think? It's just so good to see you again.
Oh, thank you so much.
And thank you for keeping it real for us.
Thank you.
We
Well,
basically were talking here in the month where we celebrate the birth of Dr. King. He said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And thank you for clearly bringing that to reality at the forefront of our mind. Now, we have about 15 minutes before you need to leave us.
Yep.
And I have two questions that I would like to ask.
Okay.
And I'm going to take the risk of asking both of them because
Okay.
I think we would want to hear what you would have to say.
Okay. That's your way of saying that you're not sure that I wouldn't take 15 minutes on the first one. You wouldn't get to the second. I got you. It's all right.
I'm just so
All right.
glad you feel
Hey,
me.
that's smart, actually. That's a smart.
I thank
yeah,
you.
go
Thank you for
it.
calling it out.
That's
You got to
that's-
use all the
that's
skills.
You don't get a PhD for nothing, right? I mean, okay.
So as our Chief Opportunity Officer, I understand that you're leading from the front. So could you give us just a little bit about what your office
Yeah.
is doing to advance equity, diversity, and inclusion for all?
Sure. So I mentioned I wear three hats. One is President of the Senate, and that comes with a bunch of things. As I mentioned, it's not just calling on people, but it's also bringing legislation. So I chair the committee that decides what bills get voted on, and I resolve parliamentary and constitutional questions that determine the outcome of bills. Just so as a little civics lesson, so I also cast tie-breaking votes, which has happened. It doesn't happen often, but I have to say I don't vote often, but when I do, I win. The second hat I wear, I mentioned I work with the governor. I fill in for him when he's out of state, and we partner together, particularly on trade and international relations. And third is I run my own agency, the Office of the Lieutenant Governor. And what we've been focusing on primarily is access to higher education. And I want to tell you why, because it's a little provocative, or it's a little controversial. So in 2016, when I was running for this office, I was traveling all around the state, and I kept hearing this sentence over and over again as I was going around the state, and the sentence was kind of bugging me. And I would hear it from Democrats and from Republicans. It was not there's no way to predict. I heard it from everyone. And the sentence was, quote, college isn't for everyone. College isn't for everyone. And it was like, why was this getting on my nerves that I was hearing this? Because it wasn't said with animosity or prejudice in the person's voice. It was said actually from a place of compassion. And I realized why, because it reminded me of my childhood when people tried to put limits on me. And people would say, because basically it's like playgrounds aren't for everyone, recess isn't for everyone, right? Like AP classes aren't for everyone, which, was said to me. And people would say, I had a teacher who said, it's hard to make this AP US history class accessible. Why can't you just take the regular history? It's not required for them to take AP US history. And my mom said, they said there's really no difference. And my mom said, well, if there's no difference, then I guess no one needs to take AP US history, right? Aren't you guys happy my mom's a Superior Court judge now? I just wanted to say. So I heard all those things. And so that was the first thing that bugged me. And then the second thing that bugged me was that the person who said college isn't for everyone always had gone to college themselves, right? And then you ask them, you say, okay, well, maybe you thought college was stupid. So what are your kids going to do? Oh, my son's going to Whitman and my daughter's going to UW. So college is for you. College was for you. College is for your kids, but college isn't for everyone. So who's the everyone, right? And so then they say, well,
but Cyrus is such an elitist, You talk to a 15-year-old, and they don't want to go to college. And I say, so, okay. So what you're saying is that there is a genetic predisposition. There's something coded in our DNA at birth. It's either you're college bound or you're not college bound. Here's what I think is miraculous about that. All the people with the college bound DNA live in Bellevue, right? And like Beverly Hills and the Upper East Side and places like that. And all the people with the other DNA live in Rainier Beach and Aberdeen and these other places. Like, isn't that just a miracle of demographics, right, genetically? So the fact of the matter is, by the time you're 15, the world has told you whether you are, and I hate this phrase, quote, college material, right? The world has told you in so many ways, and kids pick it up. What would have happened if I'd stayed, and I ask myself this a lot, what would have happened if I'd never gone out there on the playground? If we just accepted that. And I just stayed by the side of the school with the recess monitors without playing with my friends. And that became the lesson I learned, That's what happens. And so we said, all right, let's recognize the fact that a college education, to say, basically in the 21st century, to say that college isn't for everyone is in a way like saying the middle class isn't for everyone, because the jobs that are being created, the only jobs being created right now are ones that require a college degree. The only jobs being created are ones that require a college degree, and most of the ones that were lost in the Great Recession and since are ones that don't. And so what we need to do is figure out, because it's not good enough to then just say that, how do you then, because my critics on this are right, that if you just say that and walk away, you are making people feel terrible. You are making them feel like failures. That's true. You can't just say college is great, it's not great to not go, and then just let it be. Fact of the matter is there are real barriers. Tuition is a real barrier. College completion, on-time completion is a real barrier. I always say, think about what I said about we know how to do it because it's the lieutenant governor, so we can make it accessible. We know how to get on-time college completion because we do it for the quarterback of the football team. We know that it can be done when it matters. So make it matter all the time. Those are the things. But what we're doing in my office is a few things. One is we focused a little bit on the K-12 pathway, particularly around dual credit. So when Congress didn't appropriate the money to subsidize kids on free or reduced lunch to take AP exams, the actual exam fees that can cost $60 to $120, we created an emergency fund of public and private dollars. We went and raised it, $850,000 with OSPI's partnership, and every kid in the state that wanted to take AP and IB exams who was on free or reduced lunch could do so for free, and 15,000 kids did that. Then we created a program. Aimed at kids who've never had the chance to study abroad or even travel abroad, and who would be first in their family to go to college. So we said, let's create a college prep fellowship for high school students aimed around global consciousness, around study abroad. And so last year we sent our first cohort of kids, never traveled overseas before. They went to Leon, Spain, and got 10 credits from Central Washington University, and now we're providing them test prep for the SAT and ACT. And and if you guys know 10th graders, go to my website, because Tuesday is the deadline for the next cohort, applications to get in, 10th graders for the Washington World Fellowship. But the biggest scale thing that we're doing is creating college completion pathways for adults, working adults who weren't able or chose not to go to college straight out of high school, and they're working somewhere. And the first one we're doing is we're creating a Bachelor of Science in Project Management for folks in the construction trades that captures their apprenticeship learning, gives them credit for that, and delivers the rest online, so they don't need to leave work or get childcare or transportation. They can get their Bachelor of Science from Central while they're working, and we're working on a number of pathways like that. So that's the main bulk of what we're doing is around pathways to college completion.
Thank you.
Thank you. I know you had a second question.
I do. So in your remaining 10 minutes,
Are we out of time? Is that?
No,
No, okay.
We want to make sure that you
Okay.
are where you need to
I'm
be.
here, I'm
We're
on your
honoring
time.
your time. You know, Teresa Powell from Senior Director of Office of Diversity and Inclusion from the Department of Social and Health Services asked the first question today regarding basically sustainability, particularly since House Bill 1783 was dropped yesterday, calling for the creation of a Washington State Office of Equity. And while we get that you are unable to speak for the governor, I think that we as leaders in state government, we have members from the education community here, nonprofit sector, county government, city government, and we would love to hear from you. Just what challenge or final thoughts would you like to leave us with as we embark upon this work?
Sure.
And what is your vision
Yeah.
for equity, diversity, and inclusion statewide so that all employees matter?
Sure.
All human beings matter, no matter what their earth suit, that they too matter in doing the work that they'd like to do.
Well, I think, so this is really what it comes down to is, like I said earlier, executive orders are good, laws are better. And so it is important. Policy is important. And I'll tell you, what I really respect about Governor Inslee, and I'm not paid to say this because I'm elected separately, so I'm just saying it because I believe it. Here's what it is that, and I think this gets at the crux of the challenges that we have in debates about this in society, in our politics, et cetera, is that Governor Inslee believes, this is how I see it, he believes in approaching challenges from a place of abundance, not from a place of scarcity. So here's how it works, right? What happens is, you've got, person X has an agenda. Person Y comes and says, we can't do that because there's only so much money, there's only so many spots, there's only so much attention, there's only so much room in the agenda, whatever it is, right? Some form of scarcity in response, okay? That's always, if you look at it, I challenge you. Think about it throughout the day. Think about what I'm saying. Always think about the response to any kind of progressive measure. It's always some articulation of scarcity. And if you look at how, and this is not his framing, so I don't know whether he's not in the audience, but I don't know whether he would agree with me or not, but this is how I see his approach, is that whether it's climate change, whether it's racial and gender and other forms of equity, disability, he always comes at it from a place of saying, let's say what we want to do and let's go out and do it, and we can do it. This is a wealthy country. This is a wealthy state. This is a wealthy county. Seattle's a wealthy city, so don't buy it, right? When people make arguments about scarcity, like, there's countries in this world where I would believe that, right? There are countries in this world where I'd say, okay, I understand that first we got to make sure we're feeding people, right? I get it, right? But here, well, number one, there's plenty of people we're not feeding, so that's, but we have the money to feed everybody, and then we have the money to make sure that we are advancing our goals. So for example, in state government, we have the ability and the resources to go out and focus on, from cradle to career, focus on providing people the same opportunities that in many ways I was fortunate to get. You see, I tell people, because we talk a lot about the P word. Everyone's wondering what the P word is. I just like to let that hang. Privilege. Privilege. We talk a lot about that word. People like to throw it around. Who's privileged, who's not privileged? And that word can be alienating to people who feel that they don't have privilege but are being told they do have privilege. But here's my view of it. How I like to nuance it is to say, I am a person who's blind in a world that has been built by people who are not blind for people who are not blind. I'm Iranian American in a time, I've lived my entire life in a time when Iran has been the sworn foe of the United States. So I get what it's like to have a deficit of privilege. On the other hand, I grew up in Bellevue, Washington, just a couple miles from the two wealthiest people on the planet. right? I grew up with parents who were graduate school educated, mom who was a lawyer, you heard about that. So I also understand what it's like to have privilege. Everyone in this room has privilege. In one way or another, you wouldn't be here. But we also know each of us has faced different forms of deficit. So the point is, how do we find those deficits, whether they're small pockets, like relatively small pockets, like the currency discussion I had, or really large pockets, like voting rights? And how do we make sure we address each and every single one of those from a place of abundance, from the American mentality that we dream big and then we do big things. Moonshots don't have to just be on the moon. We can do them right here, and that's Governor Inslee's philosophy, and it's my philosophy, which is why we get along so well. But it's also your guys, and I want to just close by once again saying, many of you don't get the recognition that you deserve. You certainly don't get the kinds of fancy titles or standing ovations or media attention that the governor gets or legislators or I get, whatever it might be. But you're doing the work at the managerial level, at the HR level, in the agencies, in the departments, and in the community to make this a reality. Everything we do is just words if it's not implemented and if we don't have your input as we design it. So I want to say, on behalf of all the state of Washington and Governor Inslee, the legislature and myself, thank you for what you do each and every single day. God bless you all. I look forward to working with you some more.
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor. Our Chief Opportunity Officer. Let's give it up. We see you. Thank you for seeing us. And before you exit the stage, we have a gift for you. Yes, we do.
I don't have to give this to Jay, do I?
No, you get to keep it just for yourself. Thank you. You've got a license plate here with your name on it.
That is amazing.
You can feel that.